Okay, I believe we're ready to go. Thank you, everyone, for working with technology so that we can meet this evening. We have two procedural items. The first is to approve the minutes of the November 20th, 2019 meeting. And if we previously distributed them, and if there's no corrections or changes, we'll place them on file. So hearing none, we'll place them on file. The other procedural item is not an agenda item, but we have two members whose terms expire at the end of this calendar year, John and Adam. Our hope is that you'll agree to continue to serve, and if so, at the December meeting, we'll ask the board to appoint you to new terms. So I don't want to put too much pressure on you tonight, but if you're willing to indicate either tonight or follow up with an email, I would appreciate it. All right. Thank you, Adam. And John? Where's John here? Oh, John, are you agreeable to continuing? All right, I don't know what's happening here.
He's not on camera.
Okay. Well, all right, we'll follow up with that. And
There he is.
there he
No,
is.
that's Greg.
Oh, that's
Sorry, I had rep council meeting that I jumped out of.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I apologize, Greg, that we did not update our distribution list and jammed you up there a little bit. I'm glad you were able to join us.
Thanks.
We just accepted the minutes from the November 19th meeting and noted that both Adam and John's terms expire this year. Adam's agreeable to a new term, and we'll ask the board to do that at December. And John, we're having some technical difficulty, but hopefully we'll get a thumbs up from him also. So what I'd like to do is move into a review of the fiscal projections. And I will refer to page numbers as I go through there for discussion purposes. And overall, a couple significant things different this year than in past years. One is that we've recognized the Board of Education policy 8.0201 that established a general fund operating reserve, both the statutory 5% reserve and then a 10% general fund cash balance target. So combine the 15% that we had previously talked about as a committee, and you'll see that that's layered in there. We also, for the first time, are showing the 5-year capital plan funding needs with an annual transfer. And we've netted that out for some analysis purposes. When we get to the summary pages, we also netted out the full funding of the 5% reserve, and we've made footnotes on that. This year gave us two additional challenges. And as the board and the committee knows, my goal every year is to have reasonable assumptions, and hopefully reasonable assumptions lead to accurate assumptions. And with the urging that started with the committee and then trickled up to the board, I've really sharpened my pencil, so to speak, and have increased our accuracy over the last 2 years for both expense projections and revenue projections, and we'll note those as we go through. The COVID-19 crisis has been an exceptional challenge this year, and one that after consulting with a lot of my colleagues and spending a lot of drive time thinking, decided I was going to start with a base assumption of next year we go back to normal so that we have a baseline to work against. And then I presented some what if scenarios if the COVID-19 crisis is not over by the end of this year. This is also an unusual year from a geopolitical standpoint as it relates to the economy, that we are pre-COVID-19, we're in the longest recovery period since the Great Depression and since the Great Recession of 2007. And then certainly with the national political scene, there's new uncertainty about the future of the economy. I did not factor in any type of economic downturn, and that would be something obviously we'd have to deal with once we have a better crystal ball for that. So having said that, the format I'm presenting is very much the same as I've done in past years. Again, noting the COVID-19, the Great Recession of 2007 recovery, and that there will not be a new recession, and that we recognize kind of pre-COVID-19 that our year-over-year spending has increased a little bit from previous years. And that's partly attributable to the fact that we bottomed out from an enrollment standpoint, that some of our slow spending increases was funded by decreasing students in the school district. And now that we flattened out, we've become much more normal as far as spending trends. You'll see in the summary pages that we're concluding we could have a need for additional revenue as early as calendar year 23, depending on scenarios and reality that occurs over the next 3 years. And that would, you'll recall our last new levy was in 2016. A typical levy cycle in the state of Ohio in normal times is about 4 years, sometimes 5 years if you're fortunate. So if we're able to go 7 or perhaps 8 years, again, I think it's a testament to the board and to our administrative team that we've been fiscally prudent and very thoughtful about providing a quality education and adhering to our fiscal beliefs. So we will touch on that. Page 52 will be the one we talk about the most. That produces a summary of our budget performance in past years, again, where I've noted in 18-19 fiscal year, 19-20 fiscal year, we saw an increase to about 98.5% accuracy on both expenses and revenue. So I think we've done a better job of refining some of our formulas. We are assuming an inflation rate, and again, as I do every year, even though the federal government no longer publishes the rate, there's something called a school price index that historically had been about 1.5 times the consumer price index, recognizing our basket of goods is primarily staffing and benefit costs. So I've used 3% as a placeholder for inflation on discretionary spending. Bill commissioned a new enrollment study in 2019. And you'll see on page 4, we're basically flat. Now we flatlined our decline in enrollment, and a couple fascinating things are happening that I'll point out. We know that in January, we'll have a 0% increase in our healthcare cost. After this year, we have factored in 8%, which is the Great Lakes region normal inflation index for the years going forward. We're hopeful we'll continue to have effectiveness with all of our cost containment tactics and see something lower. But again, a reasonable assumption, I believe, is to look at the inflation rate rather than the historical trend because of the uncertainty year over year of utilization of healthcare. So those were kind of the major things I noted. I would be remiss if I didn't follow the secret pledge of all treasurers and refer to page 6 and remind everyone that the state of Ohio beginning in 2005, made some fundamental tax policy and school education spending policy changes that have had a very detrimental effect on our school district. The foundation program had some gradual reductions. There was an elimination of the school bus subsidy, that almost 13 million in tangible personal property taxes that was paid before has been eliminated. $10,000 personal property exemption reimbursement's been eliminated, and the hold harmless for a utility deregulation. This year, the impact is a loss of 17,115,000 in revenue. The cumulative loss to date's over $126 million. So certainly the major challenge whenever we do forecasting or talk about school funding is the restrictive revenue side, where not only are our tax revenues inflation adjusted to not grow, but on state subsidies, our second largest source of income, we've actually seen declines. Page 7 is a summary of both last fiscal year and current fiscal year's impact of COVID-19. Combining, sorry about that. Combining reductions in funding and increased expenses and some offset by some reduced spending, we still have a net bottom line spend this year of 7.6 million. Last year it was 3.1. So again, when we talk about going forward, the COVID-19 impact, I did not carry forward that 7.6 million into next year, but did run a couple what if scenarios. One of the fascinating things about our enrollment, beyond the fact that we have bottomed out as we have been anticipating for years, on page 9, whether it's because of the economy, I personally like to think it's because of a greater recognition of the phenomenal high quality education we have and our commitment to instructional technology. The percent of the resident students attending private schools has decreased by about 50%. If you look back in 2006, 2007, 19.2% of resident students attended non-public schools. Last year, 10.2% attended non-public schools. In absolute numbers, a decrease from 2,111 to 851. So one of the challenges for us from a funding standpoint is the state gives us approximately $1,400 per student enrolled in our public schools, but these families are already paying property taxes and there's no other income. To the extent that we have an empty seat in a classroom for a student, our incremental cost can be covered by the $1,400. But if we have to have a class split or we have to make other major accommodations, we could easily spend thousands and thousands of dollars more. It's one of the unique aspects of how schools are funded. But to our credit, it appears there are more families selecting our public schools than there were back in 2006, 2007. Page 11 is a summary of this year's staffing. And it shows that we hired 68.5 staff members because of the COVID-19 crisis. And that ties back to the page I referred to earlier that showed the fiscal impact for this year on the school district. And it's something, again, we're not projecting will continue, but it was there this one year. There was a staffing increase based on needs that we have throughout the district anyway, and you'll see that there. But after this year, again, we're assuming the 1 year hires for the COVID-19 crisis will go away, and all future years staffing level remains constant, recognizing our student population remains constant. More for the board than the finance committee is going to be interesting conversations going forward on page 21, where we kind of outline key events that impact this year's budget and our fiscal projections. One thing we note is in May 7, 2013, we renewed for 10 years an operating levy to avoid a deficit, and that levy will be up in 2023. So one of our challenges, it produces just over $15 million a year. One of our challenges is going to be how we layer in our need to renew that existing revenue with the prospect of some future revenue need, again, perhaps in 23 or 24, depending on the COVID-19 crisis and the geopolitical environment that we're in. So just that's one additional factor we have. Beginning on page 23, I get a little bit deeper into our annual income assumptions. In calendar year 2022, we have a 6-year reappraisal of property, and in 2025, a 3-year triennial update. I have assumed a 5% increase in residential values, 2% commercial values, and $650,000 increase in public utilities, kind of based on information from our county auditor's office and some historical performance in our district. Again, the increases are inflation adjustment, and we don't get much new money at all unless there's new construction, but we did factor that in. And we continue to assume a 98% collection rate, which is an increase. And part of the reason for our increased accuracy and overall revenue, we used to use the auditor recommended 96% current collections. We've increased that to 98%, which is much more reflective of what's happened in the past. On state foundation, you may be reading in the news about House Bill 305 and Senate Bill 376, the so-called Cupp-Patterson school funding reform. There would be a long-time benefit to our school district, but for now, I have not layered in any increased funding from a reform of the school funding program. And again, consistent with what I said earlier, I have assumed that COVID-19 reductions in state subsidies would not continue after this year for our baseline model. Kind of the bottom line's not too much different than past years. On page 26, we're assuming this fiscal year a 2.55% increase in revenue. That's primarily after the decrease that we had in, decrease last year. And then we're assuming relatively flat increases year over year going forward. And the chart on page 27 has the detailed numbers. So not much different than past years where revenue assumptions are showing that we'll be flat. On page 29, that obligatory pie charts that all treasurers use, you'll note that real estate taxes and the income tax reimbursement combined is 80.4% of our revenue. So we are very much dependent on local taxes, and state subsidies represent 14.3. So when we talk about renewing the 10-year levy or the potential for additional revenue needs, we are very dependent on the local taxpayers for that. On the expense side, again, we used the predicted student enrollment, which is essentially flat, and that led to Bill's judgment that we would be able to maintain constant staffing going forward after we factor out the 1-year COVID-19 crisis things. We're using the 3% general inflation rate. We are funding the 5-year capital plan for years going forward, and then made other, we talked about the 8% for healthcare. We're assuming Pension funding will remain constant at the current levels as a percent of budget. And the rest of the spending is basically normal, adjusted for inflation, a couple minor things. And it leads to page 41, kind of the bottom line increases for expenses. This year, because of the COVID-19 crisis, there's a 12.4% increase. When we factor that out next year, we actually predict a 1.85% decrease, then 4.13, 3.73, 4.16 increases going forward. Again, kind of matching industry standards and our traditional expense base. Page 42 has all the detailed numbers in there to show. And again, one of the key indicators is what percent of our budget is allocated to salaries and benefits. And traditional thinking is it should be under 80% or you're structurally out of balance. We are at 75.9%. So structurally, we're in a good place to do what we need to do as a school district. The summary again highlights our flat revenue challenges, but also the fact that we've been fiscally prudent. And on page 47 is kind of the bottom line summary in written format, and then we'll go to the chart. Again, we're reflecting our cash set aside policy in there, the 10% of previous year revenue on top of the 5% that has been allocated in a separate general fund operating reserve. So you'll see in 23-24, we predict negative available cash of 563,000, and that compounds up to negative cash of 25,488,000 in 24-25. And even without the cash set aside, we would still predict a $15 million cash deficit. And as you know, but I always want to restate, in the state of Ohio, we are prohibited from adopting a budget if we cannot fully fund it at the local level. So we're required either to make cuts or to have new revenue. We can't deficit spend, nor can the state of Ohio. The federal government can issue debt and do other things, but in the state of Ohio and with all local governments, we're required to live within our means. Page 48 again shows a couple numbers I want to highlight in red on the bottom line summary. This goes back to my church treasurer days where I had a big book like this for our church council, and they said, no, tell us how much we started with, how much we took in, how much we spent, and praise the Lord if there's anything left. So I have adopted this chart over the years. But this year, again, I reflected in the red numbers the impact of COVID-19 both last year and this current year, and then layered in near the bottom the cash set aside that's accordance with the policy, and also recognize that for this year also we have that one-time transfer of $2,107,000 to fund up to the full 5% of our reserve. And another way to show that is on page 49, again, where we have the operating fund transfers, a one-time item this year, and then the impact of COVID-19. We continue to be sensitive to our cash position, knowing that's the indicator when something in the future has to happen. And on page 51 is kind of the running chart of revenue versus expensive, and where we are out of balance from a cash standpoint, where we begin to spend more money than we take in. And that would happen this year. We're predicting we'll spend 17 million more than we take in after factoring out COVID-19. We'll spend 10 million more, 15 million more, 20 million more, 25 million more as a compounding effect of all the inflationary impacts occur. And then that bottom line, whether it's an absolute bottom line before the general fund cash set aside or after the general fund cash set aside, even if you want to factor in my conservatism, and I'll just use round numbers of if we collect 1.5% more revenue and we spend 1.5% less, that's 3% variance. 3% on, I'll use round numbers, $125 million, still is not enough to say we're going to have smooth sailing in those out years, even if we see that fiscal conservatism kick in. So that leads us to the what if pages and the ones that are most important, I think, as we consider how we're going to move forward in the future. And that can be found on page 53 in the shaded area, where in working with Bill Porter, we said, what if the fiscal crisis extends all next year? What would be the impact, combined lost revenue, increased spending, some savings in some expense categories? And Bill estimated $4 million, that a lot of the spending we did on the fly last year and the planned spending this year are kind of one-time spends to make us safer and cleaner as a district. So we use as a placeholder, what if the COVID-19 crisis is something we have to deal with all next year, and it would cost us $4 million? What would that look like? And you'll see in absolute dollars by the 24-25 year, we'd have a deficit of 19 million. If we factor in the board policy general fund cash set aside, we will have a deficit of 29,488,000. We did a second what if of what if the COVID-19 crisis only extends for half of next year and it were 2 million. You'll see those red numbers. And then we still predict a deficit in 23-24 and a significant deficit in 24-25. So we have to look at that and consider that as kind of the key variable that's unknown as we go forward. With that, I know I covered a lot awful fast. The one reference page I'll give you is on page 60, that last year, consistent with our fiscal beliefs, the board asked the administration to come up with rolling 5-year plans for capital spending, technology, furniture, vehicles. We had always built in vehicle, both school buses and other vehicles. We informally had a technology furniture plan, and we informally had a capital plan, but we've formalized those plans. And again, it's a rolling 5 years, so we'll always add a year, but we built into the assumptions the funding of the identified capital needs of the school district, which is in that top category. The other categories kind of offset each other. Some years we have more than enough money to fund them, some years a little short, and we will shift that money around. But we included in the fiscal projections the needed funding every year for the capital plan. So that's something that is new this year and now formally inside of our fiscal plan. So I apologize for going so fast, but at this point, I'll open it up for any questions, or Bill, if you want to make any comments on the COVID-19 impact this year or expectations for next year.
You're muted, Bill.
Spending, we hope it's a one-time thing. We need the vaccine to come through here in December or January, because the expenses, we were hit hard on the kind of equipment and supplies, ranging from hand sanitizer, masks, extra cleaning solution. There's a lot of plexiglass in the district, more electrostatic sprayers, and even PPE for our nurses and health techs. The even bigger expenses for personnel, if you look back at the one page, you can see, we hired extra custodians because we're cleaning more before, during, and after school. Also, the majority of that personnel spending went toward, 1 year long-term, we call them long-term substitute teachers. And we did that primarily with the board's support for the idea, because it allowed us in our hybrid model to bring our elementary school age children, K through 5, back to school 4 days a week instead of, in a lot of districts, in a hybrid, they might be coming just 2 days a week. At the elementary, we wanted to get them back 4 days a week, but also allowed them to spread out. So our class sizes, instead of being in the 20s, range from somewhere this year between 13 and 18 right now in those elementary classrooms. So we can get that 6 foot, CDC distancing, a minimum of 6 feet. We're using, almost all available classrooms in our elementary buildings. So spreading the students out that way with the students who decided in our hybrid model to come in person. So that has helped immensely, especially at the elementary level. The difference too that has helped with up until recently, as you know, we just made the decision to start the entire district remote this coming Monday, at least for now. But along the way, when we had cases, that especially at the elementary school, we didn't have a lot of cases, but the ones we did not end up having a lot of transmission of COVID. And we also did not have to put a lot of students in quarantine because we had the physical distancing in those classrooms. So that all was very helpful as the fall unfolded for us. So. Dan, is there anything else you want me to cover?
No, I think that's good, unless you wanted to touch maybe on the capital, the rolling 5-year capital plan and the type of things that's funding.
Sure. The capital plan, really, there are a couple different categories. Some of those are things needed to maintain our buildings. And some of those things are visible. Some of those things are not easily visible. Things that you would ordinarily keep up, roofs, windows, paving. Those are some of the big ticket expenses. And with some of the capital spending we've been doing, it was getting harder and harder to keep up. Our buildings, they are all aging, but to the credit of the district over the years, and well preceding me, our buildings, our properties are in very good shape compared to other districts that I've worked in, because there has been a lot of care and maintenance applied to those buildings and to the properties over the years. So it's a lot of good value for the taxpayer over the course of time. But we also recognized a lot of the buildings that are aging at the same time, some of the roofs may need more attention at a couple of different buildings, as an example. And so the money that we had been allocating, setting aside previously, was not enough to keep up. And that was, I think, Dan, you can correct me, I think it was around 1.2 million.
Yes.
In capital. So some years, in the next 5 years, we need a little bit more than that. To just sort of maintain those things. The other area that we looked at were campus enhancements, particularly here at the high school. Relative to other Division I schools our size, or schools in our conference, schools we're competing with, some of our facilities, we didn't have certain facilities, or some of our facilities are starting to age. And so we're building a plan to replace those or to upgrade those as needed. An example recently that's easy to see is the girls varsity softball field. We had never had our own girls varsity softball field. They had been playing on city fields that are not ideal for, girls fast pitch, to be quite honest. We also had to take into account Title IX considerations. So that was one of the first things on our list. Some of the other fields over here, we don't have a JV boys baseball field. We don't have a JV girls softball field. We have the land, but some of those fields need to be developed, and those would be grass fields. Some of the other practice fields would be redone with some new drainage in those. Eventually, further down the road, the stadium will need some enhancements. One thing that's closer up on our list is just concession stand, but bathrooms right over, I guess it would be over my left shoulder between the soccer lacrosse field and the new softball field. There are really not good restroom options for the spectators that come. So we looked at that as a project and have worked with architects to lay out what would it look like over the course of several years. And we're continuing to, with each passing year, we tweak some of those plans. But that has been something, as Dan mentioned, we've added to become part of our ongoing 5-year forecast.
Thanks, Bill. So again, I think all things considered, our fiscal prudence has served us very well in two key aspects. One is we were able to absorb the fiscal impact of the COVID-19 crisis without jeopardizing providing safe, high-quality education to our students. And the second is we've extended our levy cycle well beyond the norm in the state of Ohio. And again, hopefully we can continue to extend that as far as possible. One of the key metrics going forward at some point is timing of levies are both a statutory item of we can't have budgets that can't be funded, but also what's the right millage rate to ask the community to pay. And obviously, the smaller the millage rate, the sooner you have to go to start that collection period. You can buy a year, but sometimes that costs you more millage rate. So I'm anticipating that the board's going to have discussions, and I'm sure value the input of the Finance Committee as we go forward with the planning, and again, layering in our need to renew that $15 million levy in 2023. So while our fiscal prudence has served us extremely well, we still have all the normal challenges of our business dynamics of revenues are basically flat and expenses grow, and over time, you have to do something about that. So if there's no other comments today, we will be presenting this to the board to approve on November 24th. And as required by law, we will have it filed by the end of the calendar month for November to be in compliance with the regulations. And again, certainly stand ready to answer any questions or have follow-up conversations that we can factor into our coming discussions. So
Dan, can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
Was there any, I know you talked about it in the spring, is there any money to offset some of the costs of the COVID coming from the government? Wasn't there a discussion that they would, I know you put that in a separate category, basically, of all the expenses.
Yes, there's both at the federal level and at the state level, there's been some funding, and the funding initially was very sensitive to K-12 education. The governor cut the state subsidy to education by $443,000, and the federal government provided some additional funding to K-12. It flowed through the state to us that fully offset that cut. Whether or not the federal government will continue that, again, our baseline is that COVID goes away after this year. On the state level, there was some targeted money. We got about 420,000, I believe, in restricted funding that could only be used for CARES that we've been using for some of the staffing needs we had. And we're also using it for the equipment that goes on the air handlers to sanitize the system. Again, that's one-time money. The discussions about additional assistance, both at the federal level and the state level, have been more focused on small businesses and individuals, and I've not seen much new discussion yet on K-12 education support. So hopefully if the COVID-19 crisis continues, there'll be a sensitivity to helping us in the K-12 world, but I haven't heard much going on about that. The focus seems to be in the other areas.
Dan, I would just add that at our October 10th work session, we already started talking about the renewal levy and the need for additional monies. So we've already started that planning process.
Yes. Thank you, Ken. Absolutely. Okay. Well, it sounds like someone's puppy wants out, so I guess that means we need to wrap it up here.
It's my
All right. Well, thank you all again. I'm certainly available to reach out to me for calls or emails, and we'll continue to work together going forward. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Dan, for putting all that together.
Okay.